How did the most industrialized, wealthy, democratic countries lose their lead in tanks? Volume 1 in this series showed how Britain, France, and the US built the largest tank forces of the Great War, and were closely followed by Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Italy, and Japan. But during the 1930s, these states lost their lead to the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, which incorporated Austria and Czechoslovakia. This second volume asks whether Western states caught up during World War II, or even during the first decade of the Cold War. As you will read, some states did improve, learn, adapt, and overcome. Yes, the Western Allies outclassed Japan and Italy, but the latter had peculiarly limited requirements. Western tanks never overtook Nazi Panzers or Soviet tanks in general, despite innovations in particular. Western states did not intend to sacrifice effectiveness for efficiency, or qualities for quantities, or excellence for cheapness. Western states aimed to produce the best tanks and the most tanks. However, Nazi Germany produced about twice as many tanks as Britain, despite Britain starting with larger automotive and armaments industries. The US ended up supplying all the Allies and many neutrals too, but the US was still outproduced in tanks by the Soviet Union, and Soviet tanks were most effective and efficient. Other allies became tank producers, but too late to be significant in this war. Most states over-relied on imports, were slow to mobilize, and succumbed quickly to invaders, such as Poland, the Baltic states, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and the Balkan states. Some of these losers had designed worthier tanks than what France and Britain were offering. For instance, Poland's 10 TP and 14 TP light medium tanks, derived from American Christie platforms. Some new entrants were too remote to be invaded, but received US and British supplies before they could persuade their allies of their own designs, such as Canada's Ram and Australia's Sentinel, both derived from the US M3 medium platform with British armaments. The Western states with the longest histories of producing tanks, that is Britain, France, and the US, prioritize warships, bombers, artillery, and fortifications. They mobilize late and inefficiently. In their rush to catch up quantitatively, they evaded user requirements qualitatively. They outsourced design to inexperienced suppliers and hired personnel from those same suppliers. They enabled suppliers to diversify types to suit their own supply chains and to avoid the user specifications. Consequently, Western states piloted more new base models and variants of old models than their enemies did, without satisfying user requirements. The Western Allies ended the war inferior to either Germany or the Soviet Union in both tank qualities and the number of tank units and formations, despite producing more tanks overall. If the war had continued into 1946, German and Soviet tanks still would have been better developed than Western tanks. The users complained, but politicians and propagandists pretended otherwise. Governments deferred official inquiry, then forgot their promises. Official historians ignored the record, and private histories nationalistically and lazily followed suit. Germany's defeat and hostility towards the Soviet bloc did not incentivize the West to admit its failings. This book tells the full story of the Great Tank Scandal and its cover-up for the first time.